Hi folks, and welcome to Mountain Talk here on WMMT. I'm your host, Parker Hardison. Later in today's show, we'll hear about the Kentucky state budget, which is being hammered out right now in Frankfort, and how both state and federal policies, including big changes to SNAP and large cuts to Medicaid from the Trump administration's so-called Big Beautiful Bill, might be putting pressure on Kentucky's safety net in this year's state budget. But first, February is Black History Month, and this week we begin the show by spotlighting two remarkable Black Appalachian women. First up, using clips from the 1995 Appalshop film All About Her, we visit with a local activist, community organizer, and one-of-a-kind presence, Evelyn Williams.
And I told him, somebody will go to jail or somebody will go to hell if you come across my property. Well, we're going to leave it in better shape than we found it. Well, I'm not going to tell you what I said then.
In the mid-1990s, Evelyn Williams was in the thick of a battle on her own land in Knott County, Kentucky. An oil company was trying to drill on her property against her will, and she was leading the fight to try to stop them.
Your property will be the same after we leave as it is.
Is this right here the same that it was before you came up here?
It's just like this.
Yeah. Well, since it was just like that, I'll just sit here and see that it stays like that. I don't know of any issue, the women's issue. All those women were killed in New York City in that factory until they took action. Minors got nothing until they took action, until they were willing to die for it. So I don't know. All I know to do is to be an activist.
Born in 1915 in Kingston, Tennessee, Evelyn Williams moved to the mountains of Perry County, Kentucky when she was a little girl, and she would spend most of her life in Appalachia. Evelyn led a remarkably diverse life. She was an activist in the Kentucky mountains, a community organizer in New York City, a coal miner's wife, a housekeeper, a new college graduate in her mid-50s, and a mother of 9 children. The clips you'll hear in this story all come from the 1995 Appalshop film Evelyn Williams, produced by Ann Lewis. The film profiled Evelyn's life and work and her experiences growing up Black in the mountains.
I'm the second generation out of slavery. People were freed from slavery, and they never moved from there. My father's father was about 3 miles from where he was held a slave. I found it so strange. They thought that slaves were here because they ran and hid in the mountains. They didn't know there were slaves here in the mountains. My grandfather was in the Union Army. They used to come up and they'd say, "Oh, Uncle Ed, we fought for your freedom." He said, "No, you didn't fight for my freedom. I fought for my freedom." And he would tell, that's when he would tell, when he fought, Chattanooga Lookout Mountain and Appomattox. And he would always say, "Don't let anybody do for you what you can do for yourself." And he was very adamant about his land. Because you see, by being a slave, they did not own anything, but he felt a part of everything when he became a landowner. My father worked at an ore mines, and this mines closed, and we went to Perry County, Kentucky.
Evelyn experienced real and violent racism firsthand in Perry County, including a visit from the KKK, and even the lynching of one of her friends when she was just 18 years old.
I saw the Klan march when I was a child in 25. They tell me that is Bulin Mountain. We lived at Harvey. And the Klan would march through the black camp. And I remember one night they had set that cross afire. And it came one of those pouring rains. and it drenched the cross. And they left that cross up there. And, you know, when you come out, we lived over on the other side of the mountain. And when you come out, you'd see that cross, that charred cross up there.
Well, don't worry about me. Well, don't worry about me. Well, don't you worry about me. Jesus gonna make up my dying bed.
We were in Vico to a ball game, and someone came in and said they had lynched Rex. I was 18 at that time. We heard the noise. I'll never forget that rebel cry and that squealing and the jubilee of that time. The men went back and they worked with him. It was just one of those things. They talked about it, but there was nothing, they were powerless. And if you want to know what it means, I guess at that time, it really dawned on me what powerlessness meant and injustice meant at that time. Some blacks would talk about it and some wouldn't, because it was such a wasted life. When I left here, there's nothing had been done. And when I came back here in the 70s, there were several that pointed out different ones that had been involved in that lynching, and nothing was done.
In 1932, Evelyn married Gus Williams, a coal miner from Letcher County, Kentucky. They started a family and moved to Bluefield, West Virginia, where Gus worked in the mines. He also served as an organizer for the UMWA during an era when this was a dangerous thing to do.
Black miners were involved. They were very, very involved. Those men that were union were willing to give up their lives to organize those men. They knew. Gus used to say, "Now, Evelyn, if I go out on duty tonight, or whenever they call, now I might not come back." He was very, very union.
Down in the valley, everywhere I go, everywhere I need you.
Up at the company store, they had a canteen, whites sat over here and blacks over here. You know, you had to go in and you had to be served. But they would put a speck of paint on the bottom of the glass, you know, so they wouldn't mix them. And some of the blacks protested. And they wanted to know why that we didn't get the same service that they did. "Oh, there's nothing about it, there's nothing about it," they would say. But then they stopped the paint, the black paint on the glasses. But there was always something there to let you know you were separate and unequal.
When new coal mining machines cost Gus his job, the family left the mountains for New York City for Gus to find work. While there, Evelyn went back to school, earning a college degree in her mid-50s from the New School for Social Research. She also worked as a community organizer in Brooklyn and fought for issues like daycare and organized against the discriminatory housing practice known as redlining. In the early 1970s, Evelyn and Gus, now retired, moved back to the Kentucky mountains, to the community of Red Fox in Knott County. And after a lifetime of dealing with discrimination and working for social justice, when a gas company decided in the 1990s to drill on Evelyn's land without her permission, she wasn't about to just let it happen.
The last 4 times I came up there, I just sat right down in the middle of the road. And they threatened to call the police. And they threatened to call Kenneth. And I said, "No, you ain't gonna put me on my mama." So But here was the thing about it. I said, what are you going to have me arrested for? Sitting on my property reading a book on my property? You know, that would look kind of stupid. And the papers and the news would have eaten that up. Old woman carried off, and they would have had to carry me off. Sitting on the property, reading a book, fighting for justice.
Evelyn Williams passed away in 2002. Again, you've been listening to a radio adaptation of the 1995 Appalshop film, Evelyn Williams, which was directed by Ian Lewis. To see the whole film for yourself, check out Appalshop's YouTube page. Up next, we visit with another remarkable Black Appalachian, the beloved local schoolteacher and musician, Mabel Parker Hardison Smith. Mabel was the subject of a 1985 Appalshop film, which was also produced by Ian Lewis. And up next, our own Mimi Pickering has this radio adaptation of that film.
My name is Mabel Hardison Smith. I'm Mabel Hardison Smith. I was born Mabel Parker. Mabel Parker. So I have a long name, Mabel Parker Hardison Smith now.
In her 70s at the time of these interviews, Mabel Smith was a highly respected Harlan County schoolteacher and gospel music organist living in Big Stone Gap, Virginia. Although an exceptional woman, her story is not unlike that of many African Americans who lived and worked in the East Kentucky coal fields.
I was born in Blockton, Alabama. Blockton. My father came up on what they call a transportation. They were looking for miners to work in the coal mines up here in Kentucky and in Virginia, West Virginia. And they would come by and get the old families, haul all their belongings. There was only one train came into Lynch, and it backed in. Then it would, shoot out. I just imagine it was a shortage of miners up in this section, and so they went down, and those people who wanted to get away, there are a lot of people. Now, there were mines down that way, I answer, because my father worked in a mine down there. I think it was dolomite, this mine that he worked in. And so my people came to Kentucky, Lynch, Kentucky, in Harlan County. And so that's where we resided in 1919 when my father came up this way. There was just one main street, paved street, and we called that section up there number 4. Going up to number 4, then there was one street off where we lived. It wasn't a paved street. It was just a dirt road. There were a lot of Hungarians, a lot of foreigners there when I came. There were Germans. Actually, it wasn't any too much segregation because everybody was all there together. There were miners of all kinds of whites and blacks, and the schools were segregated, yes. But I was thrilled with the mountains. The hills, as my father called them. The hills, yes. He talked about how hard it was, and the conditions under which a person had to work. I know he used to talk about working on his knees. I can't understand that, and I look back at that now and think of that. And my father was a good provider. He was a person that he wasn't a stingy man or anything like to his family. And I can imagine him working on his knees. He said he had worked in water and on his knees, digging gold, picking with a pick. So that must have been awfully hard. And a man must love his family to do that for him, That's the truth. Must loved his family. Suppose I started playing by ear. I guess I was about 9 years old. It would be the songs that I'd hear my mother singing. Oh, let's see, I can remember. There is sunshine in my soul today, most glorious and bright. I remember that one, the tune. And she used to sing Bringing in the Sheaves a lot. Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. I was inclined, musically inclined, so I started reading music and playing the simple songs, you know, for Sunday school. I know I was inspired by my mother. My mother now went to Tuskegee Institute. And she knew Booker T. Washington. And we see Booker T. Washington was history to me. And to sit and listen to Mama say she knew Booker T. Washington. You see, he was history to me. My mother used to say that he'd say, if you're sweeping a room, she's heard him say this, you sweep it. You get it clean. Whatever the task you set to do, if any duty that you're going to do, you do that. Putting in them to study to be carpenters, to be good cooks. That's but if you're going to cook, be a good cook. You know, she said he would tell them. Her two brothers went to Tuskegee. One was studying to be a doctor, and one was studying to be a carpenter, and she was doing the teacher thing. I fell in love with a young man, and we planned to get married, but my father was a strict type, you know, and so we had to run away and marry, slip away and get married. So at that time, they had just cut the road across from Kentucky to Virginia. Now it was just mud. The road was just cut. And lo and behold, one January day, at a worst time of the year, we came across that mountain, slipping and sliding. They had just started making the cars in color. And this, I remember, his car was a deep maroon, 4-passenger car. Yes, sure it was. I remember that. We came back to Lynch, and my husband went on to work, because in those days you just came on in. He worked there at one time. He came on in and just went back to work, that's all. He was a brakeman on the motor. And that's what happened when he had his demise. He was killed, you know, had an accident there. This first time they said that he ever lay on top of that machine. They were coming out to carry the motor to the barn, that's what they called it, putting the motor away. It seems like the person that threw the switch had left it open, and the motor ran against the switch, and he was pitched forward against the concrete that near out of the mines, you know. And he was pitched forward and his neck was broken, you know. I buried my husband, the children's father, on Christmas Day in Barberville, Kentucky in 1933. It was a sad time. Mm-hmm. I was carrying my baby child. I was carrying that child. And then I had two, my old little son and my daughter, Marquita, who's teaching now in Boston. But the baby hadn't come yet. I was left with the child. Then the thing about it, I went right on back to school. But now that's a thing that happened during that time. When I buried my husband, this actually happened. And coming home from Barberville, where we buried him, and trying to sleep, that's when I had this visitation. And I heard this voice saying to me, "Go to school, Mabel. I want you to go to school." I heard it. I stayed awake until daybreak, and I went downstairs and told my mother about it. My father thought I was kind of deranged in the mind, and would tell my mother, "We need to get her away from here because the girl's losing her mind." So they did prevail on me to go back to Alabama. I had never been back there since they brought me back. And so I went down there, and in those days you rode on the back seat in the bus. I can remember a time when they would put a petition between the two races. You know, whatever number of seats they had allotted for the black population that rode the bus. I sat down and wrote a letter to the president of Kentucky State College, who was R.B. Atwood at that time. And I explained this situation to him, that I had lost my husband, but something kept worrying me to come to school. And I just want to know, is there any way I can come to school in my condition? And he wrote me back and said that, sent me an application blank and said, "We'll be glad to have you. We'll make special provisions for you." And they did. Praise the Lord. I went to school pregnant way back there in those days when you didn't go to school. I know that was the Lord.
Mabel Smith wanted to study music at Kentucky State but needed to get a teacher's certificate as quickly as possible. Her first job was teaching in clothes splint for $80 a month. Through the Works Progress Administration, she was hired to teach music at Lynch Colored School. She taught for 35 years, both before and after the Harlan County schools were integrated in 1963.
One year after school is out, and he says to us, "Well, next year now you'll be going, teachers will be integrated. You'll be going up to the white school." I had 32 children that particular year. 12 of them were white. The rest of them were black students. Coal was a common commodity there. The fathers worked in the mines to make the living, and black and white worked together. They were there together. And the children just, they got along together. Everything went nicely. Because I know in some other sections it caused pain, really. It was just like birth pains. And so yes, but in general they found out that it wasn't so bad after all. You know, it wasn't so bad after all.
Mrs. Smith remarried to a minister who worked over Black Mountain in Virginia. In 1940, they moved to Big Stone Gap. Although retired at the time of our interviews, she continued to teach music, played the organ at her church, the First Baptist in Big Stone Gap, and for the gospel group, the Evangelistic Choraleers, whose music you hear in the show.
The Lord has been good to me. I've had a job to take care of the children. My children are grown, which I prayed that I would live to see them grown. And I thank Him for them. They are doing well. They left. They made their homes other places. 2 of them live in Boston. 1 eventually came back home. So, Granny, because I have 9 grandchildren, I am happy over it. Praise the Lord.
You've been listening to an excerpt from the Appalshop documentary Mabel Parker Hardison Smith by Ann Lewis. This is Mimi Pickering reporting for WMMT.
And to see the film, Mabel Parker Hardison Smith, for yourself, check out Appalshop's YouTube page. We're going to take a quick break here to hear from some folks who make community radio possible, but stay tuned for more Mountain Talk after the break. Welcome back to Mountain Talk here on WMMT. I'm Parker Hobson. Up next on the show, we switch gears and head to Frankfort, where lawmakers from all over Kentucky have come together for the 2026 legislative session. The session started in January and goes through April. And this year, not only are state legislators drafting and passing bills, they're also passing a state budget for the next 2 years. And according to Jason Bailey from the organization the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, there's real pressure this year on Kentucky's budget and safety net. As Bailey said in a webinar last month, Kentucky was already going to have less money coming in this year because of recent cuts to the state income tax that have been passed by the Republican supermajority in Frankfort. Bailey says these recent cuts have deprived the state budget of some $2.1 billion annually. And that's money that goes towards everything from the SNAP program to local schools to Medicaid and much more. But also, Bailey says, Kentucky lawmakers have not done enough to make up for that shortfall in other ways. Meaning, essentially, because of the GOP's changes to the income tax, there's less money coming in for things like local schools and the state safety net. Meanwhile, state Republicans have said they would like to lower the income tax even more, eventually getting it to zero. On top of all that, Bailey says federal cuts are also placing extra pressure on states like Kentucky when it comes to the safety net. The Trump administration's so-called Big Beautiful Bill will cut Medicaid by nearly $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And the Big Beautiful Bill's changes to the SNAP program will place more pressure on states to provide more funding themselves if they want to keep SNAP going in their state. And all because of the Big Beautiful Bill, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that some 2.5 million people nationwide could lose access to food stamps, and that some 7.5 million people could lose access to Medicaid because of the Trump bill. And all of these pressures come on top of inflation, and the fact that, as Bailey says, Kentucky's economy has been slowing down, which he says has happened for a variety of reasons, but among them are the Trump administration's tariffs. Last month, just before this year's legislative session started, Bailey spoke at a webinar about this year's budget, and up next we hear clips from that talk.
The state budget is, sometimes we call it the most powerful tool that that the General Assembly has, that we have collectively as a state to make people's lives better, to address problems, to fill gaps that the markets will not fill on their own. And there are many, many, many ways in which the state budget sort of courses through our lives and our community, sometimes in ways people don't even notice. You know, there's more than about 1.5 million Kentuckians, kids, seniors, people with disabilities, the elderly in nursing homes, that working poor that receive Medicaid. We've got 90% of kids who are enrolled in public schools. We've got about 500,000 Kentuckians receiving SNAP food assistance, many people in public higher education, either community college or public universities, et cetera. Lots and lots of different ways. So when this tool is working well, we can do things to lower poverty, to improve health, to address the quality of life. When it's not, we see those problems get worse. So the health of our budget is extremely important to the lives of every single Kentuckian. Since 2008, when the Great Recession hit, we have lost some significant ground when it comes to the budget. Post-2008, there were cuts made to a lot of areas in ways in which funding was frozen for a number of years. And we never have gone back and made up that lost ground. And it's been, 15 plus years now. where we're dealing with those effects. So if you look at core funding for schools, what's known as SEEK, those are 25% below inflation-adjusted 2008 levels. The average teacher salary is about 20% below. Higher education funding is 29% below what it was back then. We have 13% fewer state employees. And for retirees who haven't received cost of living adjustments, their checks are worth 43% less than they were back then. So those are just a few examples. There are other areas where more money has been put in, but when you look at the broad set of services that many Kentuckians rely on, we've definitely lost ground. That's part of the context as we go into this next budget. We did, however, in recent history, have an unexpected opportunity, ironically so, in the pandemic. This is annual general fund revenue growth. That's the main source of revenue for our budget. That's the taxes that we pay, the income, sales, state property, and other taxes that we pay. During the Great Recession years, 2008, 2010, after you adjust for inflation, revenues actually declined. But then really when the pandemic hit in fiscal year 2021, 2022, we really saw some strong growth. And so some opportunity to make up some lost ground. But for reasons I'll talk about momentarily, that was sort of a unique period. And in fact, we saw most states have this kind of very strong growth the last couple of years. Largely, what the General Assembly did with these funds was not reinvest in those core services. Instead, they did two things. One is stow the money away in what's called the Budget Reserve Trust Fund or Rainy Day Fund, kind of what you want to have put away in your reserves to help prepare for rainy days and help deal with the shortfalls that result. You can see we didn't do a good job of putting money away. So we needed to do that when these extra monies came in. The General Assembly, though, went beyond that and put a huge amount of money into the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. Started to spend some of that money down in the last session, but still there is a significant balance in that fund. The other thing that they did was begin to enact permanent tax cuts, and particularly reductions in the individual income tax. Kentucky's had an individual income tax since the 1930s, and it had a top rate of 6%. It was reduced to 5% back in 2018. And then the General Assembly, during this period where monies were flush, a lot of revenue coming in, enacted a law that creates a so-called trigger mechanism that they say gives them permission to lower the individual income tax by 0.5 point a year, with this explicit goal in state law of getting that tax down to zero. So they have been following that law, but also changing the rules on that law to allow these income tax cuts to trigger. There have been 3 reductions as of January 1st. The rate goes down to 3.5% as of January 1st. And these cuts are very, very expensive. So before the individual income tax began to be reduced in this manner, 41% of what we collect to pay for our budget, to pay for schools, infrastructure, healthcare, and other things, came from the individual income tax. So you can sort of imagine that when you reduce it as much as we have and as much as the goal in state law to get it to zero, this is extraordinarily expensive. And there's really nothing that's being done to replace this lost revenue in the plan that the General Assembly is pursuing. There were some sales taxes applied to some services initially, but even that has sort of stopped and the lawmakers are just cutting. Again, that hasn't been a huge challenge when revenues were strong and they were coming in as fast as they were for a couple years there, but that in fact proved to be a temporary situation, really fueled by the federal stimulus that Congress passed that provided aid to people, put money in people's pockets for things like unemployment benefits and stimulus checks during the pandemic. People spent that money, it circulated in the economy, created strong job growth and revenue growth, but that has faded now, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. In the meantime, the costs of making these permanent cuts to the individual income tax based on temporary economic conditions that weren't set to continue is starting to add up. And the cost, again, of reducing the income taxes from 5 to 3.5%, which lawmakers have now done, is about $2.1 billion annually. And to put that in context, that's more than the core funding for K-12 schools, for all of our K-12 schools at the state level, what they spend. It approaches the Medicaid spending that we do. It's more than we spend on higher education, et cetera. So really one of the biggest outlays in funding in state history has been these reductions to the individual income tax. It is a hugely monumental decision of how to allocate resources, and it's becoming very, very expensive, and the cost of that is beginning to come due as these cuts are being phased in. So there's several, I think, trends and threats that lawmakers face as they go into the 2026 session and develop a new 2-year budget. First is the implementation of these state tax cuts. They were designed to be phased in over time. The phasing in is happening, and the revenue is being hurt as a result. The economy is also slowing for other reasons, for reasons outside of the state's control, and have to do with federal policies around tariffs, around immigration, around budget cuts at the federal level. Is causing the economy to slow, and that is affecting revenues as well. And then we have a new development in 2025 in that Congress passed H.R. 1, so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that includes significant other cuts in federal programs and the shift of costs over to states like Kentucky's that they then have to deal with that they didn't have to deal with before. So to take these in a little more detail, again, with the national economy, it is certainly the case that job growth is slowing down. If you look at the national picture, since April, barely any jobs have been added. We're a few months behind because of the federal shutdown and so forth on terms of state numbers, but the state picture is pretty much mirrored this. We've seen a slowdown in job growth, and that affects how much revenues are available. And we have seen that the picture in 2021 and 2022, where we had really strong revenue growth as a result of the federal pandemic stimulus, that has really stopped and even reversed. And we are returning to the kind of period we had back during even the Great Recession or other recessions where revenues just are not keeping up with inflation. You can see that starting in 2023 and all the way through the forecast of 2028, you see revenues growing slower than inflation. There is a real decline in the amount of money that we have as a state as a result. At the same time, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are new costs being shifted to the state that it hasn't had to deal with before. One of the biggest of those is for the SNAP Food Assistance Program, which again provides food aid to over 500,000 kids, seniors, people with disabilities, low-wage workers. The H.R. 1 that passed Congress that the president signed shifts more of the administrative costs of SNAP over to states. In Kentucky, that's $66 million more by the year 2028. And for the first time in the history of the program, which goes back to the war on poverty, the state can be required to pick up a portion of the actual program cost, the actual cost of the benefits, which could be up to $188 million a year for Kentucky starting in 2028, depending on a calculation of what's called the error rate that states have. So we're talking about a potentially very large new outlay of resources that the General Assembly is going to have to fund at the same time that, again, revenues are slowing down. And just put that amount of money in context, $66 to $254 million a year. We only spend $84 million a year, the state does, on preschool. So these are very large numbers. These are equivalent to a huge new program that the state is going to have to pick up. We're also going to begin to see the impacts in this budget of federal Medicaid cuts that were in H.R. 1. Those are being phased in over time. They're very, very expensive, very costly to the program. And a lot of people are going to lose their health coverage as a result due to new rules that are being put in place that states like Kentucky are going to have to pay to implement. We also know from studies that have been done that we have more hospitals that are at risk of closure if these federal cuts are allowed to continue than any other state. We have 35 rural hospitals across the state that are at risk of closure. So the risk of the loss of services, the loss of coverage that affects not just Medicaid recipients, but anyone who has to use these services is very serious as these cuts and shifts go into effect. And the state is going to have to figure out how it's going to budget for and deal with these problems. At the same time, we know that for most Kentuckians, the concerns about things like healthcare, food, and other needs, and most Americans for that matter, is growing and is considerable. Affordability is the #1 issue that everyone reports when they talk about what they're concerned about. They're concerned about the cost of electricity, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of their food when they go to the grocery store. There are many things that states can do to help deal with this problem, but this is what people are concerned about. And there are many ways in which the budget helps with affordability issues, but if there's not enough money in the budget, those things get hurt. We saw that last month when the senior meals program was cut. We know that will be an ongoing challenge, that those funds will restored, but that's one of the many things that may be at risk as we go through the next budget. So in terms of the affordability issues and the income tax cuts that lawmakers have put into effect, we wanted to really understand better what those impacts were. We talked about how expensive the income tax cuts are. It will be $2.1 billion in 2026. That's, again, more than we spend on base funding for K-12 schools. So there was a poll recently done by Change Research that looked at surveyed registered voters in Kentucky, over 2,000 registered voters, and asked them, among the questions that were asked were, how have the individual income tax cuts impacted you? And only 9% of Kentuckians reported that the income tax cuts have helped them. Almost as many said that the cuts have actually hurt them. 40% said they haven't been affected, and 43% are not sure. So it certainly was not a resounding result that this huge new outlay of resources that the General Assembly has put into effect by deciding to reduce our largest revenue source is something that Kentuckians say is really benefiting them. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons that may be is that when you reduce the income tax, most of the money goes to people at the top. Around 60% of those cuts go to the top 20% of people who make more than $135,000 a year. In fact, the top 1%, the richest 1% of Kentuckians, receive more from those income tax cuts than do the bottom 60% of Kentuckians, low and middle and working class Kentuckians combined. So the income tax cuts are really skewed to the people at the top. For the average Kentuckian, a half-point cut may be enough to pay for one phone bill or one oil change, not enough to really make a difference in the affordability challenges that folks face, but enough to take a lot of money out of the budget that would otherwise go to things that could help. To put it also in a different context, the cost of these half-point income tax cuts, if they were put into something like education, it can make a real difference. So just for the same cost as a half of a point income tax cut, which is $718 million a year, we estimated how much putting that amount of money into our schools, that would allow each and every district to do. And we have a report on this on our website you can look at to understand better. But it would essentially allow us to pay for an 8% raise for teachers and, say, school employees, help deal with the shortage in our public schools, hire over 2,000 more teachers and school counselors and other staff to lower class sizes, improve mental health, and have additional funds, about $59 million statewide, to pay for things like more bus drivers, more family resource centers, and free school meals, etc. So the top priority of lawmakers has been these income tax cuts. Very few people are saying that they are being helped by these income tax cuts, but we know that putting that same amount of money into other things like public schools makes a huge difference. The poll from Change Research also asked a number of other questions on this topic, and Kentuckians really go beyond saying that the income tax cuts are not helping them and support instead a policy of actually asking those at the top to pay more. So one of the questions it asks is, state doesn't expect to bring in enough money to cover its costs for the next couple of years for reasons I've talked about. To close this gap, would you prefer lawmakers focus on making cuts to schools, healthcare, and other public services, or generating more revenue by raising taxes on the wealthy? And by a margin of 69 to 31%, Kentuckian voters said they would rather generate more revenue by raising taxes on the wealthy. Similarly, the poll asked, would you prefer that lawmakers in Kentucky focus on reducing taxes for everyone, even if most of the benefits go to the wealthy, or improving schools, improving healthcare, and bringing down the cost of living? And by a margin of 72 to 28, Kentucky voters said they would rather focus on the latter. The poll also asked very specifically, would you support a wealth tax on the richest 5% of Kentuckians to pay for some specific things that help with affordability? And between 60 and 75% of voters said yes for every policy that was polled. So a state child tax credit of $1,000 a year to help families afford the cost of raising kids. Similarly, with more affordable healthcare options, more funding for affordable childcare, and expanding public preschool, which is one of the governor's priorities, and as well as putting more money toward the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to build more units of affordable housing and deal with our housing crisis. So very broad support for raising taxes on the rich. And that question or that issue comes at a time when those folks, the people at the top, have received enormous tax cuts, both from the state cuts that have been passed over the last decade, but also federal tax cuts that have been enacted, both from H.R. 1 that I talked about earlier that cuts Medicaid and SNAP. It also awards large tax cuts, especially to the people at the top, as well as the 2017 Trump tax cuts. So we had this analysis done, again, by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. How much are the richest 5% of Kentuckians receiving in federal and state tax cuts because of those cuts enacted over the last decade? And the total is stunning. It's over $3 billion a year in tax cuts. Well, that's more than the state spends on the Medicaid program. So when you talk about a situation where potentially hundreds of thousands of Kentuckians can lose Medicaid coverage, when we have 35 rural hospitals at risk of closure, it seems like a real challenge until you look at the fact that the people at the very top have received enormous tax cuts, that even a portion of which could help address that problem if lawmakers were willing to go down that road. So we asked Kentuckians, we said the richest 5% of Kentuckians are collectively receiving $3.4 billion a year from recent federal and state tax cuts. Do you support a settle-up tax on the wealthiest 5% to help improve schools, healthcare, and public services? And similar to the previous poll results I talked about, 67% support, 26% oppose, and 7% are not sure. So there is wide support for actually going in a completely different direction than the priority, which has been to reduce the individual income tax. And there are a lot of things that can be done at the state level if there are more resources available to make life more affordable for the many. We put out a report that I'll also plug that's on our website. There's some things you can do to help make life more affordable, address this top issue of the cost of living that don't cost money, like helping support the growth of unions and improving the minimum wage. But there are other things that do cost money, and we outline some of what those are in this report. But if you look at the opportunity of having those at the top settle up for the tax cuts they've received by chipping in more and paying their fair share, these things don't seem insurmountable. So I want to leave you with just a few things. What is decided for the budget is very consequential for services that Kentuckians rely on and things they care about. And so we want to encourage folks to go ahead and start now with being engaged. And it's important that lawmakers hear from you at the beginning of the session as they begin to craft this budget. So we'd like folks to consider a message that says, Kentucky families are stretched thin and more people than ever are struggling with the cost of living. But the state income tax cuts the legislature has passed are not helping because most of the benefits go to the wealthy. At the same time, these tax cuts cost over $2 billion a year. We need for investments that can truly help make life more affordable for the many and protect our schools, healthcare, and more. And I'm writing to urge you to prioritize all Kentuckians by putting a halt to budgeting for further income tax cuts, instead asking the top to pay their fair share of taxes so we can invest in a better Kentucky for all. On that last paragraph, I will say a couple things. One is that the trigger for additional income tax cuts did not go off this summer because of the deteriorating budget conditions. However, some lawmakers are saying they may pass another tax cut anyway. So it's important that that not happen, and that lawmakers hear that message, that further digging this hole deeper is not the direction we want to go in. Even if they don't do that, they could pass a budget that is very austere and that makes room for additional tax cuts over the next 2 years. So we want them to halt that as well. We don't want them to cut funding for things so that more of these income tax cuts that go to the wealthy are happening. Instead, put a different idea on the table. We know that asking the wealthy to pay their fair share of taxes is very unlikely to become law by April 15th, but now is the perfect time to start this conversation as the impact of these cuts begins to show, and as the cuts to things like Medicaid that are happening at the federal level will continue to squeeze that program over time. It becomes a huge problem for the state, and we have to start the conversation now about a different direction that we want to go in. So that's the first thing, is to contact your legislators. You can also stay in touch and stay informed about what's going on in the General Assembly and what's in the budgets that are being proposed and debated by going to KY Policy's website, kypolicy.org. We have an email list you can sign up for. We're also on all of the social media platforms. If you'd like to follow us and keep up with the analysis that we put out, we will be making sure Kentuckians understand what is being debated and what the implications are for them. And the last thing I'll share is that we'd like you to please save the date of February 25th. We're hoping to hold an event on that day in Frankfort where we send a message to lawmakers about the budget and about what Kentuckians' priorities are, what they're concerned about, what works and what doesn't. So please save that date. Consider joining us in Frankfort. We'll have more information soon on exactly what that will look like.
You've been listening to Jason Bailey of the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, or KCEP, speaking in a webinar last month about this year's state budget, which the General Assembly is hammering out right now in Frankfort. And as a final note here, in early February, the Republican supermajority in Kentucky's House released their proposed draft budget. And while these numbers could still change, according to analysis from KCEP, the proposed GOP budget would reduce funding for Kentucky schools by some $100 million. And it could also leave Kentucky hundreds of millions of dollars short in funding both Medicaid and SNAP for the next 2 years. And again, this is on top of the Trump administration's big, beautiful bill, making nearly $1 trillion cut to Medicaid, and large changes to SNAP, which the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says could cause millions of people, Kentuckians included, to lose access to SNAP and Medicaid. KCEP urges everyone to get in touch with their state representatives if they have thoughts or opinions about this year's budget. And that's it for Mountain Talk today. Thanks so much for listening. For WMMT and with Mimi Pickering, I'm Parker Hardison.
Fading dreams and visions of the friends of lost and gained make me awfully cold and lonesome at night on the train. I slept right. Lord, I cannot find my rest. Weary of this traveling, but this way seems the best. Been a lot of places for my living. I pick and sing, and it gets awfully cold and lonesome at night on a train. With memories of sunsets and the loves I've left behind, all these times that I've traveled just to find that the fading dreams and visions of the friends I've lost and gained make me awfully cold and lonesome at night on a train. On a train.